Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. I just wanted to quickly say a huge thanks to Sophie and Casey, who've invested so much time in making this a reality. And this is just a wonderful celebration of wildlife tracking and all the people that practice it. And so I hope we do more of these and that we can broaden and include more diversity of people practicing tracking in a creative fashion. So let's just jump into my talk. Tracker biologist, scientist. Which are you and which do you want to be? So I'm a mountain lion biologist by training, and so actually trained as an ecologist. And it's the species that I've sort of devoted much of my work to, and they're what I study day to day. So I just thought I'd start with them. This is by no means a mountain lion talk, but I am going to be talking about mountain lions. If there's one thing that I could ask you to remember about mountain lions is that they are a super interconnected species, perhaps more than any other carnivore in the world. And I mean that at least in terms of what we know, meaning what has been published in the scientific literature. We just did a review. I work with folks from Defenders of Wildlife, and we documented over 500 different types of biotic relationships that include mountain lions, which is astounding and without doubt just the tip of the iceberg. But what am I going to talk about now? I am going to talk about mountain lions. This is a map of what we're up to today. I'm going to talk about who's eating from mountain lion kills. Then I'm going to talk about some research on mountain lions as seed dispersers. And then I'm going to talk about bumblebee problem solving. And then last, hopefully there's time to talk about cheetah scent marking and communication hubs. So bear with me, 4 different research chunks, only one of which is related to anything I've done. So who is eating the meat? So what I'm talking about is research done in Northwest Wyoming, just north of the town of Jackson. And we're specifically interested in what animals are coming to feed at mountain lion kills. And I'll just give you a little visual here. This is a coyote having an interesting interaction with a golden eagle and some magpies watching and stealing food as they can. But this is a coyote coming in and feeding at a mountain lion kill, so an elk killed by a mountain lion. And just to fast forward, this is red foxes. These are red foxes in the exact same area coming in to feed at a mountain lion kill of another elk, in fact. So what's interesting about this data that right here, I'll kind of, if you see my arrow, I'm going to talk about this. On the bottom are the years of the study. And then on the side are percentages. And what that is in a given year, say 2001, researchers went to a series of mountain lion kills. It could have been 50, it could have been 300. And this records what percentage of those kills did they document the presence of coyotes and red foxes. So in 2001, about 65% of those kills had coyotes at them or evidence of coyote, and red foxes, there were 0. And this was not based on cameras. These are only kills at which researchers relied on other stuff or other evidence. And so it might be some sightings, although those are less common. So you might come over a hill and be like, oh, look, there's a red fox and it's running off. So that would be included here. But mostly it's going and saying, okay, what footprints do I see around here, feeding from the carcass, what poop, things like that. And so you can see that it changed over time and, sort of zigzagged the amount or percentage of kills where coyotes were present. And interesting enough, there was hardly any foxes being documented. In fact, none until 2006, at which point there were, still very few foxes at kills. And what interests me most is where I'm circling my cursor is this change that occurred between 2011 and 2012. Huge shift. Suddenly, you've got all these years in which foxes are hardly ever at kills, if ever, and coyotes are the dominant sort of scavenger or between the two species. And then whoops, there's this big switch. And from 2012 onward, foxes are the more commonly detected, we'll say, species at mountain lion kills than coyotes. So I really wanted to know why. So what I'm going to talk about is this particular pattern, the red line, which is the presence or detection rate of red foxes. And so I wanted to know why. So I looked at some different ideas. In fact, I looked at 4 different things that might explain it. So the first I'm going to call the carnivore cascade hypothesis. And this is based on what we know about interactions among wild canids. In the top here, you can see mention of some research by Tal Levy and Chris Wilmers, a great paper talking about this very cascade sort of and evidence for it in wild systems. So we know that wolves control or limit the number of coyotes. We know that coyotes will go out of their way to kill red foxes and limit them. And so the cascade idea is that as wolves increase in a system, they reduce the number of coyotes, which in turn increases the number of red foxes because they're released from the pressure put on them by coyotes. And in this particular study system, there was a huge and dramatic increase in the number of wolves over the course of the study. And so we want to know whether this pattern of the increase of wolves can explain or correlate with this pattern we're seeing in red for red foxes. And I can run some math, and what I can do is actually look at the percentage of the pattern that is red that is explained or correlates with the percentage of, or the, excuse me, the pattern of wolves. And I found that 30% of that red pattern could be explained by the data on wolves, which is, kind of cool. It looks like there is a relationship between the number of wolves in the system and the detection of red foxes it kills. So then I try to know something else, and this we'll call the predator-prey hypothesis. This is the idea that, the number of carnivores in a system is largely related to the number of prey that's there. And the famous research has been done on lynx and snowshoe hare. So as snowshoe hare go up, they're the blue lines in this bottom left sort of rectangle down here. As the blue goes up, the lynx follow. They go up, and then when the rabbits crash, which happens every 8, 9, 10 years, the lynx crash as well, and then the rabbits go up, and then they crash, and then they go up and crash, and the lynx follow along with those rabbits. So ideally for red foxes, I would have liked vole data, but I couldn't find any. There's no vole abundance data for our study system. The closest I could get was rabbits. Wyoming as a state does the statewide index of rabbits to track that cycle of rabbits, and they use it to predict and estimate the number of bobcats on the landscape as well as other animals as well. And so I looked at whether this pattern in the lower right, this pattern of rabbits, might explain the pattern in red, which is the detection rate of red foxes. And boom, absolutely not. We got 0% of this pattern in red was explained by the abundance of rabbits in the state of Wyoming. Darn. Again, it would have been better to have voles, but it's something. But then last night I thought of one more thing. I didn't create a separate slide for it, but I thought maybe we could use water, annual precipitation, because precipitation should cause green grass to grow, which might be correlated with the number of voles. So maybe this is another way of getting at this predator-prey hypothesis. And that did a little bit better, but it only explained about 2% of the pattern that we see in red. So again, not particularly useful. So then I tried one more thing. And this paper in the bottom left corner there is led by Jonah Evans, who's also giving a talk this weekend. It's just one of many papers that shows that distinguishing tracks is difficult. And I was actually hired to run this project in early 2012. And one of the things I, of course, started doing was going out with everyone in the field. And I noticed that a lot of people had a difficult time differentiating coyote and red fox footprints. And they almost always called anything coyote footprints. So I started to wonder, could this perhaps explain the detection rate of red foxes over time? So, this is, again, not to be mean or critical, but I pulled this off the internet. I typed in red fox and coyote tracks, and this was one of the first things to pop up on the internet. These are the kinds of resources that researchers rely on to help them differentiate tracks in the field. And you can see from these drawings, that would be really tough. And then add snow where you can't really see the whole footprint. It's just really hard to identify tracks sometimes. So what I did was look at a different pattern. I looked at the number of cyber tracker tested and evaluated staff on the project over time. There were none in 2000 until 2012, and then you can see there's a zigzag in the number of certified trackers that were actually the field people working on the project looking at the sign around mountain lion kills. And lo and behold, that explained 70% of the pattern that we see here in red. So the greatest support suggests that it's actually people that explains the difference in red fox detection of kills, not wolves or water or rabbits. But I haven't tested, whether we could perhaps take wolves, which did offer some support, and people, and create a new model with both of those variables to see if we even have a stronger model. But it's a pretty interesting finding. Just one more thing, you can see the pattern again. I'll use my cursor here, and that switch from 2012. We also started using a lot of motion triggered cameras in 2012 and putting them at kills. And I have one more year of data that's not on here, but just from 4 years here, 2012 to 2015, you can see that just on the kills with cameras, that foxes are far more abundant or more common at mountain lion kills than are coyotes, which supports the data that were reported by the field team from Tracks and Sign at kills over that same time period. Cool. So another paper. This one is not my own, but given my interest in mountain lions and their ecological roles, I was super excited to read it when it came out in early 2016. And this is a paper, you can read the title right there, that was about the potential roles of mountain lions as seed dispersers. So a really interesting ecological role that they might play in ecosystems. And here's a graphic from a different paper, and I may butcher their last name. It's Hämäläinen et al. In 2017 in Ecosphere. Apologies for that name pronunciation. But this is the idea of what we're talking about. Plants produce seeds, birds eat seeds, carnivores eat birds, and then they move around on the landscape. And their diagram was more politically correct than what I've done here. They didn't show the deposition of those seeds, which is poop. So I added the poop. And some amount of seeds pass through all of these systems and make it into the poop of the foxes or mountain lions or whatever, and they germinate and they spread seeds on that across the landscape in that way. So this particular project, which was based in Argentina, and this is the location in Argentina in South America, if you're not familiar where Argentina is, and this is where the research occurred. What they did is they focused on this part of the diagram. I put it in red. They just collected scats and then they germinated seeds from those scats to show that some of them were indeed viable and they were indeed being spread by carnivores pooping around the reserve. And so when you read their methods, it says they collected cougar scats. And between 2010 and 2012, they went around and they collected poop on internal and peripheral roads within the reserve. So it was a little alarm for me. I was like, oh gosh, they collect them on roads. That's, in my 20 years of studying cats, I've not seen, them poop on roads a lot. They're not like bobcats or foxes or coyotes that mark roads. So I thought it was an interesting method. And I was blown away by their sampling. They got 123 scats over the course of their study. And again, it was a little bit of an alarm because I'm not sure I've seen 100 scats on roads across my entire career studying mountain lion. Perhaps if I included overgrown logging roads, but even then, I'm not even sure I've got 100 scats on roads. Maybe I do, but again, it would take that long. So the other part of their research, which to me was quite shocking, was they reported that local mountain lion diet was 54% doves. In fact, this species of dove called the eared dove, and that animal weighs 4 ounces. And that if you add in the other small birds, which they estimate was about 6% of their diet, that means that 60% of what mountain lions ate in that area were small birds, which, that's that's would be incredible, because that is so different than any other diet study for this species anywhere else in North or South America, where they predominantly eat at least medium, if not large, mammals. And so it was like, whoa, that seems kind of crazy. So I said, maybe deer and other things are super rare there. And I couldn't find any abundance estimates for specific to that region, but I did find descriptions on tourist websites for the reserve where the research was done. And here's one at the bottom here, where it says that at sunset, that herds of deer are a common sight. So here's a research area that where deer are common, and yet mountain lions are preferentially selecting tiny birds instead of deer, which again is just odd. I just want to emphasize that I know I'm being critical, but I have no intention of being rude or mean about this research. This research is awesome. It is such cool ecology, and I absolutely love it. But I do think there is reason to believe that what they're describing in this paper is actually the ecological services provided by foxes. Because I wrote to the authors and I asked them, I said, did you use genetics to identify the scats? I really wanted to know that. And second thing, did you, well, if you didn't use genetics, how did you differentiate mountain lion scats from other species? And the other thing I wanted to know is, were there foxes there? And they wrote back graciously and they said, we didn't use genetics, we used morphology, and it was quite simple. Big scats were mountain lions, small scats were other animals. Ooh. And then the other thing they said was, yeah, foxes and other middle and small carnivores inhabited the area. So that's why I think it's fair to believe that perhaps they're describing fox diet and not mountain lion diet. This is also because it's well documented in science literature that people have a hard time differentiating scats, to species level. This is a study that was, from quite a few years ago, where researchers gathered snow leopard scats, and they only gathered scats and called them snow leopard when there was a footprint of a snow leopard or a scratch of a snow leopard or something else that they felt was evidence of snow leopard. And then they brought them back and they shipped them off to a genetics lab and they tested all the poop, and they found that 54% of those quote snow leopard scats were in fact scats of red foxes. Here's one from closer to home from the USA. And so researchers went out in the field, they identified coyote, bobcat, and bear scats, and then they assigned a confidence level. So some they said, yeah, these are high. I'm absolutely sure that this is a coyote. Some they said, I think it's a coyote, but I'm not sure. So they analyzed just the high confidence scats collected by these people, the ones they were pretty certain on. And they were only right 54% of the time in identifying coyote, 57% of the time for bobcats, and 95% of the time for bears. Identifying scats is tough, but it is not impossible. Here's research where they used indigenous hunters to identify the species of scats, all in this forest preserve around a village. And they brought them back to the lab, did the same thing, tested them, and they were 100% accurate. So it is possible. It's just difficult to identify scats to species level. That was a lot of words to really say very little. I'm going to make some gross generalizations now, but, I think they do generally hold true. And you're going to be able to think of people who don't fit in these boxes, but I think most people do. And so let's focus on that sort of general pattern. What I would emphasize is that trackers or hunters or field people, whatever you want to call this group of people, those skills, they have real field skills. They can identify footprints. They can identify scats. They can know their bird calls. They know their plants. They have wood sense, meaning that they can move on the landscape and generally remain safe. They know how to navigate terrain. They know what to do if they get stuck in an area overnight. They have some general ecological sense. Louis Liebenberg tells great stories about Nuncabe, who was a master tracker for many years ago, who's passed quite a long time ago. but he would be able to point to a bee in the Central Kalahari and say, that bee feeds on that flower, and this bee feeds on this flower. And just that knowledge of interconnectedness between species and flora and fauna. Trackers or hunters, whatever you want to call them, they don't have training in research design. They don't have training in data collection or computer skills or data analysis or science writing. And I'm going to hold off on science thinking and I'll discuss that in a moment, but they don't have those training. A biologist, in comparison, they have little to no training in field skills. Some programs have like a field class where you mist net some birds or bats in small mammal trap and, do some things like that. But, many don't have anything. They have no training in safety or navigation or wood sense. There's variable training in ecology or ecological thinking and connection. There's really strong programs that offer a lot of classes to train biologists in that. Others have very little. There is very strong formal training in research design, data collection, computer skills, which including mapping and analytical packages, which gets into data analysis. They have formal training in data analysis and differentiating types of data and how to run it through analysis to get results. And they have training in science writing. There are two things I just hammer home that may have come up for you already in listening to that comparison. And the one thing I'll say before I do that is that I just want to make sure you understand I'm not saying that one is better than the other. Trackers are not better than biologists. Biologists are not better than trackers. They are apples and oranges. They have different skill sets, and that's great. That's totally fine. They're just different. Nobody is born a tracker. Nobody is born a biologist. You have to learn these skills. You have to put in your time and sometimes your money to get these skill sets, and they're just different. So it's a choice. Two things that have come up, though, I'll just emphasize that, especially in recent years, there's a tremendous concern over the deterioration in field skills and field knowledge among the current or newest generations of biologists. And so people are raising alarm that although we're producing students with tremendous analytical skills, tremendous training on computers, we are losing their connection to actual field skills. And that is going to influence our science and our results and our understanding of ecosystems. Another paper on the same topic. And the second thing that it may have already shown you is that there's a natural bridge between what trackers, hunters, field folks have and what wildlife managers, researchers, etc. need. And some of us, Louis Liebenberg in the foreground here, has spent his entire life in trying to build bridges between people with field knowledge and field skills and those that could utilize those skills. And hopefully doing it especially for these groups who are overlooked and oppressed, and bringing them into the light so that they can be recognized for their knowledge, paid for their skills, and pulled into a society in new ways and allowing their knowledge to help facilitate wildlife conservation of our world more broadly. Following this logic, we can say that a tracker is someone who practices tracking. A biologist is someone who practices applied biology. And a scientist is someone who practices science or practices science thinking, is a practitioner of science. And I'm going to use this particular research project as an example. So in this project, scientists came together and they studied the ability of bumblebees to differentiate patterns and solve problems. They wanted to know whether this was possible. And they have a wonderful definition for science in the bottom, and it's sort of out of the normal. So I thought I would share it with everyone. Science is the process of playing with rules that enables one to reveal previously unseen patterns of relationships that extend our collective understanding of nature and human nature. So let's hear from the scientists themselves what they did.
We came up with the question whether we could teach bees a pattern or basically, or if bees could learn. We trained them to learn a puzzle that we created through games and pictures. We kept bees in a beehive, just like a plastic box. We let them into a glass really big box with split into quarters and with a series of circles where blue in the inside surrounded by yellow and yellow in the inside surrounded by blue. We had a sheet of paper replicating the circles on the in the cube, and we put a dot in every one that the bee went in. And first off, we put sugar water, which is basically their reward, in the middle, and salt water on the outside. But they didn't just go for the middle; they went for colour, and they learnt that. Most of them went to the middle, and then we changed the colour, and some of them chose different tactics. Some of them choose colour. Some of them choose just where it'd be. We let the bees in one by one, and we recorded the data onto a sheet, like a symmetrical sheet, and wherever the bee went, we put a dot down. We came up with a question whether we could teach bees a pattern or
I'm just going to pause that so you can hear me. These scientists were 8 to 10-year-old children, and they didn't do it in total isolation. They did it in collaboration with their science teacher and with a local scientist named Biologist, who is really invested in seeing science practiced in open spaces, public spaces. But the children came up with their own questions, they came up with their own methods, and they actually conducted the entire experiment themselves, gathered their own data, and here it is recorded, correct and incorrect times that the bees chose the right or wrong tube with a reward. And then they were able to work with Bo to write it up in a way that could be published in a prestigious science journal. It was amazing. They're the first group to ask this question of problem solving for bumblebees and the first to come up with some answers. This idea of science thinking is really based on what many people call the scientific method. You come up with an idea or a question, a hypothesis, if you will. You collect data, and then you analyze that data, and you come up with a conclusion. So you can think of bears. You're following bears in your backyard. You love learning about them. You say, "Gosh, I wonder where they scent mark." And so you start to make a hypothesis. I think they scent mark more often near wetlands. And so then you say, well, I'm going to track them 100 times, and I'm just going to see where they come, and I'm going to analyze the data afterwards to see where they scent marked. Boom. That's a really informal, it can all be in your head, but that's following this scientific method. You gather the data, you say, oh my gosh, they scent marked at these wetlands, but they also scent marked here and there and there. What's the difference among them? And so, like most scientists, you're now following the cycle of the scientific method. You end up with a conclusion or an answer that leads to more questions. And there's a couple of other things that I would emphasize when we talk about the scientific method. One is this entire thing is all based on creativity. To be a scientist, to think scientifically, you must be a creative person. You must be curious. You have to come up with questions. If you can't do that, you're going to have a miserable life as a scientist. There's some other words that people like to throw out there when they talk about science or scientific method, science thinking. One is making sure that any hypothesis you create can be falsified, meaning that you need to have a hypothesis that you can test and see if there's evidence to support it or refute it. Because if you create hypotheses that you can't actually learn whether or not you support or refute it, it just lingers there. It can become mythology. It can become a crazy idea that actually has no support at all. You also want to make sure it's repeatable and that it's transparent, that everyone can see what you did, have their own opinions on whether it worked or not, and of course humility, because it's absolutely fine to have crazy hypotheses. What's wonderful about science is you put out your crazy hypothesis, you either support it or you don't. And there's nothing wrong with refuting a hypothesis. You just make up a new one. And so humility is really important within the scientific process. There's a lot of things that scientists could be. They may or may not have field skills or wood sense or blah, blah, blah. But what makes a scientist is that they think in ways that are following research design, data collection, data analysis, and that all equates to science thinking. Biologists receive very formal training in thinking this way. Trackers, something that Louis Liebenberg has argued for years, is that tracking is informal training in science thinking. You're following a trail, you make a hypothesis. The animal's going to that water hole. It either does or it doesn't. And when you get there, you have your data to refute or support your hypothesis. Then you make a new one. Now I think it's going to sleep. And then you test that hypothesis. As simple as that is informal training in thinking as a hypothesis with alternatives. It could be going to the water hole or it's going up the hill to sleep. And then you get your support, you have evidence, and you build story after story after story, evidence after evidence. And that's science thinking. I'd like to close with an example of what I thought was really cool research and really apply it in this way. So cheetahs create scent posts by backing up to trees, and they squirt urine onto these trees. And they use the same trees again and again and again. And this research was conducted in northern South Africa. And these researchers put GPS collars on all the cheetahs in the area, and they found that they were urinating or scent marking on the same tree or a group of trees over and over and over again. Even as different cheetahs replaced each other, they still used the same places, and they called them communication hubs. And what's cool is this is actually movement data of cats that didn't live there. These were cheetahs that would just pass through. And even those that just passed through would visit and revisit and move from communication hub to communication hub to communication hub. So it shows you that cheetahs, even the residents that live in these places and those that are visiting, say young animals looking for a territory that then pass through, they're all tied to place. And specifically, they're tied to these communication hubs where they're all scent marking on these trees or checking in on who else has scent marked on these trees. And so what was really cool about what they did is they took that knowledge of cheetah spatial ecology and then they created new hypotheses. They were interested in conflict with livestock because that's such an important issue for carnivore conservation, for the welfare of local farmers, economics, et cetera, et cetera. Specifically, cheetahs in the area were known to kill calves that were quite young, still suckling on their mothers. And it was a big issue. It's why local ranchers were not particularly supportive of cheetah conservation. It was this driving conflict. And so, what to do about it? Because cheetahs are tied to space, these researchers suggested, well, let's build an experiment and see if we move cattle out of these communication hubs at the time when they're suckling youngsters, could we reduce that conflict? And lo and behold, by doing this, they found that they could reduce cheetah depredation of calves by 86%. That's incredible. And such cool relationship between starting with tracking in ecology and scent marking and applying that to a real world conservation conundrum and coming up with a solution. So cool. I'm going to close with a couple of thoughts. One, trackers have amazing and very useful skills. Trackers, hunters, field folks. And they are incredibly applicable to current wildlife management and wildlife conservation. And hopefully you see that intersection. Two, that trackers have all of the necessary tools and informal training to be real scientists, that they are scientists. And so that any team that is charged with designing research or a conservation strategy, I would encourage them to benefit from the inclusion of trackers or field-based folks at that earliest stage, because they have so much to offer in research design and thinking about the ecological relevance of questions and the approach for whatever you're doing. This paper right here only came out about a month ago, led by Louis Liebenberg, and I share it because it also is just one of these papers that emphasizes that everyone can be a tracker. And so here, this is a long quote from the paper, but it says, that science is a process that involves empirical observation, experimentation, causal inference, creating and testing hypotheses, creating novel predictions, and all with the purpose of producing scientific knowledge about the world, regardless of who participates. And this paper really focused on a problematic aspect of calling some people citizen scientists or types of research citizen science, because the word citizen is super problematic. It can be oppressive because it excludes huge communities, and it can also be exclusive in that some folks don't even want to be a part of what's considered the citizens of a particular area. I would go one step further and just say that one of the things that I feel is worrying about citizen science as a term or a label is that many trained scientists or trained biologists will say they look down on what's called, quote, citizen science. And following the definitions as I've just laid them out, everyone can be a scientist. And so people are either practicing science and conducting science, or they are not. And we all have that potential to be a scientist. And with that, I say thank you. Tracker, biologist, scientist, which are you and which do you want to be?